Today, advocacy is often measured by how loud you are and not how hard you listen. Hands up if you've heard the term performative male before. I see a couple hands up. Well, this term performative male is an internet phenomenon that has stemmed from meme culture, and they're usually characterized by their wired headphones, specific fashion taste, and advocating for women's health by saying, cancel period cramps, in hopes of attracting women. But through this, women's health has slowly been morphing into a punchline, a performance put on for attention. These men just wanted to be heard, but what is it like to be seen? Well, we live in a world where women often aren't seen and our health is often dismissed. This manifests in clinical funding, the integral rock of medicine. And according to PubMed, funding bias tends to overfund men's diseases and underfund women's diseases. The talk I'll be giving you today is on medical misogyny, and I hope to shift your perspective on how healthcare presents itself differently on women. And I think you'll realize that hits closer to home than you may have guessed. So starting off with endometriosis. For those of you who don't know, endometriosis is a painful condition that causes tissue to grow outside the uterus, affecting 1 in 10 women of reproductive age. Historically, it has been chronically underfunded and under-researched, leading it becoming a hot topic in women's health. But just 9 years ago, there was this study that came out on how endometriosis affects the male partners of the women who suffer from it. And while I do agree that this can be an important area of research, it highlights a key problem in our priorities. When the funding does go to women, the focus often shifts to the male perspective, even on diseases that primarily affect us. Another one. Attractiveness of women with rectal vaginal endometriosis. Are we serious? I seriously can't think of a reason why this information would be useful to anybody, and yet, this study was done on 300 women. 300! With this type of effort, we could have moved one step closer to a cure, and yet, our intentions always seem to be misaligned and stray away from actual women's health. And this isn't just a niche issue either. On social media, we often hear women sharing their stories about how they feel dismissed by the healthcare system. And it is true, our pain is systematically dismissed. One of my friends had 4 visits to the GP for her heavy periods, and each time she was prescribed birth control that would only make her feel worse with side effects like weight gain, acne, and lower self-esteem. 4 years later, she still suffers from the same problems, and she feels as though she was dismissed and only prescribed medication just as a quick fix. Let's simulate what it would be like in another case like this. Imagine you're a 27-year-old woman working as a talented engineer with your whole life and whole career ahead of you. One day, you start noticing that you have lost weight and that you're chronically fatigued. So you go to your trusted GP. And just after 10 minutes with said GP, they say, I'll come back if it gets worse. Well, it got worse. Your fatigue persists, you start vomiting, and your clothes are now 2 sizes too big, so of course you go back. It's just long COVID, it should go away soon. But ironically, you never had COVID. You then go back to the GPs 18 more times, and each time you receive the same results thrown at you. No referrals, no further action, no escalation of care. This is the real story of Jessica Brady, how her symptoms were ignored, never investigated further, and allowed to debilitate. Just 3 weeks after she was diagnosed with an aggressive 4-stage cancer, she died. Her death was preventable, and in her mom's words, nobody listened. Nobody took it seriously. Following her death, a new law was put into place called Jess's Law, where care had to be taken to the next level after 3 appointments with the same persisting symptoms. But why does it take the loss of a life for people to interfere? This isn't a new problem either. Although Jessica's case was not explicitly due to gender discrimination, many of her experiences are symptoms of it. For example, a study that was done on rare diseases showed that men's average diagnostic time was 3.7 years, while for women, this is nearly 50% longer at 5.4 years. Healthcare professionals also seriously underplayed her signs of cancer. First, she was misdiagnosed with long COVID and then with the kidney infection. This is an example of how illness in women are too often attributed to less serious causes, And it's also an example of how hysteria still persists in medical culture, especially among women. An Australian survey done on women with chronic illnesses showed that 32% of women were first misdiagnosed with medically unexplained or psychological issues, or just chronic pain. That's a third of women whose health is invalidated. This is a graph of a man and a woman's hormonal cycle over 28 days. Do you see how for the women it's nearly a straight line, but for do you see how for men it's nearly a straight line, but for women it keeps on going up and down? Well, scientists think the same way as well. Women's cycles are said to overcomplicate variables in research, making men the default to study as it gives cleaner, more predictable data, leading to many scientists deterred from even studying female mice. The standard biological framework in medicine is a man, and we assume that this framework applies the same to women, but it doesn't. This assumption is wrong, and it's the cause for so many gaps in our knowledge for how certain diseases affect us differently, or how certain drugs affect us differently, which then rolls over to diagnosis and treatment. This then raises the question, is our health expendable for convenience? Is this worth excluding half the population? The caution to include women largely stems from the thalidomide scandal. And for those of you who don't know, thalidomide was a commonly used drug in the 1950s to treat women of morning sickness when they were pregnant. But it later became apparent the harm it was causing as babies started to be born with severe birth defects. Later, in 1977, the FDA actively recommended a policy to exclude women of childbearing potential to protect them and their fetuses. But this protection has consequences. In fact, it has only been 33 years since women legally had to be included in clinical trials. And I know for a fact that there's people older than 33 here. That just shows how recent the change is, and the system is yet to catch up to show more representation. But what are the repercussions of this negligence? Drugs are given to both men and women at the same dosage, but study revealed that when the same standard dose was administered to both men and women, 88% of the drugs tested had longer elimination times and higher concentrations in the blood of women than men. And a further 96% of these drugs had higher adverse reactions in women than men. And the reason for this is that we fail to take into account that women metabolize drugs slower than men. We fail to take into account that gender is a variable, which then leads to many women having to suffer the consequences such as bruising, nausea, or headaches because of people in the labs overlooking us. There's this phrase, this may cause some discomfort. And I believe this phrase to be one of the biggest lies routinely told to women. Gynecologists often say it before inserting devices in a woman's womb. But what follows from many isn't mild discomfort, but rather severe pain. A doctor who once worked at a women's health clinic told me that women describe the pain there to be the worst of their lives, and yet no pain relief is administered, not even as something as basic as paracetamol, just because it simply isn't standard procedure. But who set that system up? Well, there's this belief that women have the natural ability to tolerate pain, whether because of cramps or childbirth, but this isn't true. We don't feel less pain, we just expected to hide it. And we learn to hide it because expressing pain, cramps, backaches, or anything related to our cycles is socially dismissed. And as a result, our pain is minimized and we're just constantly expected to firm it. This gender gap is strongly prevalent in contraceptives as well. We often hear about pills, implants, injections, hormones that women can take, but what about the men? Why should women alone continue to shoulder the responsibility of Planned Parenthood? And why is it that this is a societal norm for this to be a woman's burden and not a man's? Not only does the cost of contraceptives add up, but so does the biological toll. This is a picture I took of my friend's birth control side effects sheet, and as you can see, it's pretty humongous. It's fully in English and it's double-sided and it's so big that I could be using this as a blanket in a sleepover. And the worst side effects, although rare, are lupus, hepatitis, strokes, benign or malignant tumors. And just for a year, the cost of these contraceptives can be up to £60 when bought privately. So why hasn't there been a mainstream male birth control yet? Well, let me tell you why. In 2016, there was this clinical trial that tested 320 men on this new male hormonal birth control, and it was 96% effective. But the trials were stopped as men started dropping out due to side effects such as mood swings, depression, and acne. What isn't striking is that the trials were stopped, but rather they were stopped because men were experiencing similar side effects to what has long been considered acceptable for women. And yet, the women's hormonal birth control remains widely prescribed, while men's hormonal birth control sits on a shelf collecting dust. And it highlights a key problem in our society, how we react differently when the complaints are coming from a man. And this then leaves me wondering, whose pain is prioritized? Questioning this isn't anti-men, but rather it's pro-equality. I'm so passionate about this because many of the women closest to me have experienced this. It's a collective struggle for half the world, and I feel so frustrated that there's nothing I can do if I don't have a medical degree or if I'm not in the labs. But what we can do is talk about this. We don't hear about this enough. We don't hear about women's voices concerning their health. And who knows? Maybe if this was talked about at the dinner table or on the TVs at your school clinic, women's health would stop being treated as a second thought. And if there are any performative males in the audience, stop performing and start to care, as medical misogyny is a bigger issue than you.